Upon opening his body at the Royal Palace of Madrid on November 1700, the physicians anticipated discovering the typical markers of royal mortality: a weak heart, diseased lungs, the predictable vulnerabilities of an inbred lineage. Yet, what they uncovered instead was something that rendered 3 centuries of European history suddenly and terrifyingly comprehensible. Within the corpse of Charles II of Spain, they discovered organs so deformed, so grotesquely twisted, that one physician reportedly collapsed and another declined to proceed with the autopsy. However, it wasn't solely the physical horror that unsettled them. It was the understanding that this grotesque assembly of barely functional organs had somehow worn the crown of the world's mightiest empire for 35 years. And if you believe you already know the conclusion of this tale, you are mistaken. Because the nightmare concealed inside Charles II was not merely medical, it was the culmination of 2 centuries of intentional genetic devastation, orchestrated by Europe's most powerful family, with the icy precision of a scientific experiment in human debasement. If you truly care about what history conceals, click subscribe now, because the next story we reveal may be one they never wished to be told. In 1665, when Charles II assumed the Spanish throne, his empire continued to cast its shadows over 4 continents. Silver from the Spanish Americas funded armies that advanced from Milan to Manila. Spanish navies patrolled seas where the sun never set on Habsburg territories. From the Escorial Palace near Madrid, a single signature could ignite wars that would devour millions of lives, could alter Europe's power balance with the mere stroke of a quill. Yet every fortress has a flaw. And this particular fissure had been festering within the royal family itself for generations. The very bloodline that had conquered the New World and dominated Europe was systematically annihilating itself through a marriage strategy so disastrously defective that it resembles a blueprint for self-inflicted biological warfare. The Habsburgs had mastered the practice of marrying their cousins, not occasionally, not accidentally, but as a deliberate policy aimed at consolidating power within their dynasty. For 2 centuries, they had been spinning a genetic net so dense, so incestuously tangled, that by the time Charles II arrived, his family tree more closely resembled a wreath circular, self-devouring, and ultimately asphyxiating. Yet the architects of this genetic disaster could not perceive what they were constructing. In their eyes, Charles II was not the outcome of centuries of biological mismanagement. He was the sacred vessel through which God had chosen to demonstrate Habsburg rule over the earth. When he came forth from the womb on November 6th, 1661, physically deformed and mentally delicate, the royal physicians did not perceive genetic inevitability. They saw a trial of faith, a challenge to be surmounted through prayer, medicine, and the unshakable conviction that royal blood could prevail over any human weakness. Right from birth, Charles's deformed body held the genetic harm built up over 8 generations of planned intermarriage. His family tree showed his great-great-great-grandparents repeating many times. Charles's parents, King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were both spouses and uncle and niece, making genetic catastrophe not just probable, but unavoidable. Charles II didn't receive a kingdom so much as a centuries-old genetic bomb. Yet his court pretended it was a precious gem. The boy destined to be Spain's final Habsburg monarch didn't learn to walk until age 4, excessively that he couldn't properly eat solid meals. His tongue was oversized for his oral cavity. This made his talking almost impossible to understand. His head appeared too massive for his neck. It drooped sideways, unless he focused hard to hold it straight. Portrait artists, spent years mastering ways to conceal his defects through careful poses and flattering lighting. However, they couldn't mask the real truth encoded in his DNA. That Charles II wasn't only physically impaired but also mentally limited, to such an extent that the notion of absolute monarchy became a twisted mockery. But he wasn't meant to reign, he was meant to endure. And even that looked doubtful. Any childhood sickness turned into a national emergency. Each feverish episode had nobles rushing to prepare succession documents. Each convulsion sparked quiet arguments over whether God was punishing the Habsburgs for their sins or whether a demon had possessed him, needing exorcism instead of medical treatment. The child set to rule a vast empire from Peru to the Philippines was unable to manage his own basic physical needs. He couldn't put together logical phrases or grasp the simplest ideas of governance or tactics. Yet the Spanish court was too committed to the pretense of Habsburg excellence to admit the obvious. Rather, they built a grand performance of normality surrounding their shattered monarch. Tutors were brought in, not to teach him everyone quietly, recognized that was impossible, but to create the illusion of a royal education. Military advisors updated him on military campaigns that he was incapable of comprehending. They reduced intricate strategic choices to simple yes or no queries that could be answered with a nod or a gesture. Government officials got accustomed to handling the actual affairs of the empire behind closed doors. Afterward, they put on ceremonial meetings where Charles would mutter his consent to decisions in which he played no role. The irony was unavoidable and deeply saddening. The Spanish Empire, whose authority rested on the divine right of kings, was now ruled by a man with such severe cognitive impairments that he had trouble telling the difference between his kingdom and his breakfast. Still, every law enacted under his name, every war waged beneath his flag, every territorial surrender signed by his unsteady hand held the complete authority of the crown. Charles II may have become the most influential puppet in all of history, controlled not only by cunning courtiers, but also by the relentless logic of a genetic disaster that had been building up to this very point over many generations. The physical truth of his illness was equaled by psychological suffering that went beyond what medical knowledge of the time could grasp. Charles wasn't merely disabled, he was sufficiently aware to realize his own disability, intelligent enough to understand that others saw him as a twisted parody of kingship, yet utterly powerless to alter any of it. Court documents depict him sobbing uncontrollably at public events, not only out of sorrow, but from the crushing bewilderment of being forced to play a part that he couldn't comprehend, for an audience that clearly loathed what they witnessed. His teachers recorded that he occasionally spent hours gazing at paintings of his forebears, the mighty Habsburg rulers who had subdued entire continents and led vast forces would then gaze upon his mirrored image and start shrieking. The boy who took over the heritage of Charles V and Philip II could scarcely write his own signature. However, he was expected to represent the ongoing glory of a dynasty that had influenced the path of human civilization. Spain's aristocracy, constrained by decades of tradition and an urgent necessity to uphold the illusion that their empire was still powerful, turned into reluctant participants in this sorrowful spectacle. Dukes who led thousands of troops ended up meticulously instructing their monarch on the proper way to grip a blade for official paintings. Nobles who ruled extensive lands dedicated their hours at the palace to instructing Charles in fundamental manners, the proper posture for sitting during meetings, when to nod suitably during diplomatic briefings, ways to keep from salivating onto official papers. Yet underneath the meticulous orchestration of palace existence, everybody recognized the underlying reality. The Spanish kingdom was not governed by Charles II, it was devoured by him. or more precisely, by the hereditary disaster he represented. With each passing year of his rule, new proof emerged that the Habsburg lineage had ultimately drained its physical potential. His convulsions increased in frequency and intensity. His bodily abnormalities grew more evident with age. His intellectual ability, which was never considerable, appeared to decline instead of improve. This rendered him progressively reliant on those around him for even the simplest choices of day-to-day living. Not to mention the intricate demands of running a worldwide empire. The royal doctors, constrained by palace etiquette to sustain the pretense of the monarch's well-being while privately recording his decline, started to look like scribes of a gradual catastrophe. Their confidential medical records resembled tales of terror, detailing a physique so biologically corrupted that it appeared to be fighting against itself. Body parts collapsing one after another, mechanisms deteriorating quicker than they could be mended or offset. Nevertheless, these very doctors were obligated to release public announcements regarding the king's strong health and keen intelligence, his capability to keep guiding Spain toward a bright future, which everyone understood was no longer achievable. The calamity was not merely personal. It represented a collapse of an entire civilization. The Spanish Empire had built its very identity around the false belief in Habsburg genetic supremacy. Based on the notion that royal lineage held a God-given right to govern those of lower status, the mere existence of Charles II rendered that myth impossible to maintain. However, discarding that myth would require accepting that Spain's whole political system rested on a base of deceit and self-deception that had built up over hundreds of years. Ministers adapted to rule by working around their king instead of relying on him. They would decide matters in secret councils, then orchestrate elaborate rituals where Charles would go through the motions of giving royal consent. Diplomats from abroad received thorough instructions on how to decipher the king's different grunts and gestures, and how to act as though his garbled ramblings held deep insights into global politics. The whole apparatus of the Spanish state progressively adjusted to operate in spite of the man who was supposedly in charge, rather than thanks to him. But even as the court mastered the art of navigating Charles II's shortcomings, his mere existence kept eroding the authority of all they sought to uphold. How can you preserve the prestige of an absolute monarchy when the absolute monarch cannot even manage basic human dignity? How do you convey an image of imperial might when your emperor is obviously and unmistakably feeble? How can you assert that your dynasty has divine approval when God appears to have afflicted your lineage with worsening genetic decay? The women involved with Charles II bore the greatest cost for the dynasty's unwillingness to admit what was plain to all. His initial spouse, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, came to Madrid in 1679 at age 17. A princess from France, she had been led to believe she would wed the most powerful ruler in Europe. But what she discovered was a childlike man whose physical disfigurements were equaled by mental disturbances that rendered closeness not merely impossible, but horrifying. Correspondence from Marie-Louise to her aunt was intercepted and meticulously altered by Spanish court censors before being permitted to reach France. And these letters depict a young woman gradually crumbling under the strain of maintaining a marriage that was nothing more than a political performance. She recounted discovering Charles in their bedroom, at times nude and sobbing. He could not articulate what distressed him. Yet he was evidently haunted by urges and feelings that his impaired mind was incapable of handling. In her writings, she noted his habit of conversing with unseen individuals, his prolonged episodes of vacant staring, abrupt fits of aggression, and then bouts of childish guilt and bewilderment. However, Marie-Louise was not merely confined by her marriage, but also by the entire diplomatic structure that her union with Charles embodied. The relationship between France and Spain relied on perpetuating the pretense that this was an ordinary royal union between capable rulers. Acknowledging Charles's condition would have been equivalent to conceding that France had basically offered up a princess to a biological disaster. The equilibrium of European power depended on an alliance with a king who was essentially unable to grasp the concept of alliances or their significance. Physicians appointed by the court to oversee the royal marriage ended up recording a medical anomaly. Charles II was not merely cognitively disabled, he suffered from sexual dysfunction that rendered the creation of a successor, the complete rationale for his marriage, effectively impossible. Nevertheless, these same physicians were compelled to produce periodic updates regarding the king's robust condition and the favorable outlook for a royal heir. These were reports that everyone recognized as falsehoods. Yet diplomatic convention mandated that everyone treat them as fact. Marie-Louise passed away abruptly in 1689, with appendicitis given as the official cause. But the circumstances sparked quiet rumors of suicide or poisoning across Europe. Her death was lamented as a tragic departure. Yet for those aware of the truth behind her plight, it seemed more like an escape from a prison term that had been masked as a fairy tale marriage. Charles's second spouse, Maria Anna of Neuburg, stepped into this horror, fully aware of her predecessor's fate. But she was still constrained by the same diplomatic obligations that had ensnared Marie-Louise. Maria Anna adopted a different approach to survive. Whereas Marie-Louise attempted to preserve a shred of authentic human interaction with her husband, Maria Anna regarded their union as solely a ceremonial duty, engaging with Charles only in public settings, living otherwise, as though she were a widow whose husband just happened to still be alive. In the meantime, the royal doctors had transformed into a sort of clandestine group of medical plotters. Charles's lead physician, Dr. Gaspar Bravo de Sobremonte, left personal journals that resemble the writings of someone gradually descending into madness. One entry after another detailed symptoms and actions that lacked any terminology in 17th century medicine. The king's seeming hallucinations, his moments of catatonic gazing, his habit of repeating empty phrases for extended periods, and his failure to identify known individuals or recall recent discussions. But at the same time, Dr. Bravo had to take part in intricate medical performances intended to uphold the pretense that the king was healthy. He prescribed therapies he recognized as ineffective for ailments he was forbidden to identify. He gave drugs that could never treat genetic defects which medical science then lacked the language to explain. Most disturbingly, his duties included routinely assessing the king's ability to father children. He wrote deliberately phrased reports on Charles's suitability for siring offspring. Even though everyone aware of the situation understood that the Habsburg lineage had already delivered its last tragic heir. The Spanish Church, whose institutional character was founded on the belief that Habsburg rule had divine approval, found itself in a similarly hopeless situation. How can you uphold the claim that God selected a specific dynasty to govern when the most recent member of that dynasty seems to be a living contradiction to divine providence? Their answer was to reinterpret Charles II's clear disabilities as spiritual trials instead of genetic disasters, to convert his pain into proof of his sanctity instead of his human frailty. Father Gabriel de Cusa, who served as the king's confessor, privately recorded how impossible it was to offer genuine spiritual direction to an individual whose ability for abstract reasoning was so drastically restricted. Nevertheless, he had to portray Charles's religious practices frequently, just mechanical recitations of memorized words, as proof of deep spiritual wisdom. The very church that professed to care for souls ended up taking advantage of the spiritual suffering of a person who could not possibly grasp what spiritual suffering entailed. However, Maybe the most heartless element of the institutional conspiracy was the way it turned Charles II's real anguish into a spectacle benefiting everyone but him. His convulsions were reinterpreted as instances of holy rapture. What was once his failure to grasp intricate political matters was reinterpreted as profound reflection. His clear fear during formal events was reframed as the proper solemnity expected of a monarch. Any authentic sign of distress or bewilderment was instantly spun into proof of a profound intelligence that supposedly validated his ongoing reign, forced by centuries of feudal duty to uphold the pretense of a capable king. The Spanish nobles transformed into unknowing tormentors within this intricate masquerade. Noblemen who had seen real combat were reduced to instructing Charles at court on how to grip a sword without self-injury, how to stay mounted on a horse and not tumble off, how to remain standing straight through the long ceremonial events required by royal tradition. Yet his physical state rendered this nearly unattainable. Even with these adjustments, they could not hide the core truth. Spain was ruled by someone incapable of ruling himself. Foreign envoys ended up conducting actual diplomatic negotiations with Spanish officials, while the ceremonial audiences with Charles felt more like touring a strange menagerie than meeting a sovereign. In letters to the Doge, the Venetian envoy described Charles's habit of laughing at the wrong moments during grave diplomatic discussions, his attempts to nibble the parchment instead of reading it, and his failure to focus attention for longer than a few minutes. Sustaining these intricate pretenses came with an enormous financial price tag, already burdened by centuries of war and colonial governance. The Spanish treasury now had to bankroll a growingly costly system of cover-ups. Custom-made furniture was necessary to keep Charles from harming himself in the course of state events. Squads of attendants had to watch his every action, clean up his regular mishaps, and offer the non-stop care his condition demanded, all while pretending he was autonomously ruling an empire. Army generals answered to state ministers instead of the monarch, but still had to orchestrate detailed briefings. Charles would receive stripped-down accounts of intricate war strategies and be rehearsed to deliver replies that could be spun as authoritative command. The chasm between Spain's actual military strength and the pretense of royal leadership expanded annually, leading to crushing losses that eroded Spanish influence across Europe. All while those involved blamed these defeats on transient misfortunes instead of a core failure in command. The Spanish court turned into a stage where each person was both performer and spectator, both actor and casualty. Upholding the mirage of a capable king demanded the concerted involvement of hundreds of individuals. Though fully aware, they were ensnared by the very economic, political, and social structures their deceit was meant to uphold. Courtiers whose lives had been devoted to the monarchy realized they were instead serving a remarkably intricate falsehood. It had begun to exist as an entity all its own. It devoured resources and wrecked lives, yielding nothing but the ongoing illusion that Spain was still a great power under capable leadership. How can one remain faithful to a king who has no comprehension of loyalty? How do you serve a monarch who fails to grasp the idea of service itself? How can you uphold the honor of institutions when the individual who represents them has become a tragic caricature of human dignity? For 35 years, the Spanish court grappled with such issues, never permitted to admit that these were indeed questions deserving of consideration. The conclusion did not arrive with the grand spectacle that centuries of Spanish glory might have implied, but instead with the pitiful cry of a shattered man surrendering his empire, unable to mentally grasp his actions. On October 3, 1700, while Charles II was dying in the Alcazar Palace, French and Austrian envoys hovered around his bedside like birds of prey, each thrusting papers into his shaking grasp that would decide the destiny of millions spanning 4 continents. Charles signed the documents they handed him because his whole life had been spent signing papers he was unable to read, endorsing decisions beyond his comprehension, green-lighting actions he could never fathom. His last royal deed mirrored every act of his entire reign. The robotic execution of monarchical power by someone inherently unfit to wield it. Through these signatures, he left the Spanish Empire to Philip of Anjou, a French prince who would later be crowned Philip V of Spain, thus guaranteeing that the War of the Spanish Succession would devastate Europe for the next 13 years. However, the autopsy conducted after Charles's passing exposed the profound horror that had been eating away at Spain internally. The doctor, Juan José Daza, along with his medical team, discovered a corpse so hideously deformed it looked like a textbook example of genetic disaster, rather than the remains of a human being. The heart of Charles was said to be no larger than a peppercorn. His lungs had deteriorated so badly they were unrecognizable. His intestines had completely decomposed. What was most alarming was his brain, the organ thought to have directed the Spanish Empire for 35 years, was discovered to hold no blood whatsoever and was compared to a dried-up walnut. Decades after the Habsburgs became a mere historical oddity, the physician's report, which had been deliberately hidden for years, was finally released. It read as an accusation not solely against one man's genetic heritage, but against an entire governmental system that had insisted that such an assembly of failing body parts could effectively govern millions. More than just one man had perished in that palace room. It marked the ultimate destruction of the false belief that royal lineage inherently bestows any unique ability to rule over people. In just a few months after Charles passed away, the Spanish Empire started its unavoidable fall apart. The War of the Spanish Succession broke out as European nations scrambled to occupy the power void created by the Habsburg downfall. Italian territories belonging to Spain were repeatedly transferred between different rulers. Spain's American colonies suddenly found themselves being ruled from Versailles instead of Madrid. The Bourbon Dynasty, which took over Charles's throne, showed greater allegiance to France than to Spain in its commitments and priorities. Still, the genuine tragedy went beyond the decline of Spanish supremacy. It was the exposure of the enormous number of lives given up to sustain a deception that everyone recognized as false. Generations of Spanish troops had perished in conflicts ordered by a monarch incapable of grasping the concept of war. Countless people in the colonies endured hardships due to policies implemented by a king who was mentally unable to understand the real human impact of his nominal power. Courtiers' whims and prejudices had dictated the governance of entire regions. They asserted they represented a monarch incapable of articulating his own thoughts clearly. The Habsburg dynasty's pattern of genetic decline provides a disturbing foretaste of atrocities. Those atrocities would climax in the 20th century's fixation on racial purity and genetic perfection. The same reasoning behind Habsburg marriage practices the idea that inbreeding yields better humans later fueled eugenics programs. These initiatives included sterilizing disabled individuals, euthanizing the mentally ill, and eventually leading to mass genocide, all rationalized by pseudo-scientific concepts of genetic ranking. Charles II served as both a target and an agent of an early version of genetic manipulation. This was carried out via marriage strategies instead of lab methods, yet it stemmed from the same core fallacy that a person's value could be measured by the purity of their lineage. The Habsburgs' self-destruction mirrored the mindset that later rationalized Nazi racial policies, Soviet genetics theories, and U.S. sterilization initiatives. This conviction maintained that certain people are naturally superior, and that superiority could be maintained and intensified through controlled reproduction. Today, We observe similar institutional complicity as existed during Charles II's rule. These dynamics unfold in modern politics, corporate leadership, and societal frameworks. We witness leaders whose mental deterioration is deliberately hidden by aides and the media's cooperation. We observe company executives whose ability to make decisions is impaired by sickness, age, or mental instability. Nevertheless, they still hold significant sway over people's lives, while their issues are handled like classified information instead of a public health matter. The movement for disability rights has provided us with terms and legal systems absent in 17th century Spain. However, it has also exposed how limited our advancement has been in certain basic respects. We continue to inhabit cultures that view cognitive differences as things to conceal rather than adapt to. These communities regard intellectual disability as a thing of disgrace, not as a natural diversity in human life. Our institutions continue to be built on the myth that leadership demands a level of mental stability and lucidity that only a handful of people truly have. We continue to jeopardize the welfare of at-risk people in order to preserve the reassuring fictions that our systems rely on. The tale of Charles II sheds light on the awful human toll exacted by political systems. Such systems place a higher value on organizational steadiness than on personal dignity. They insist that truth be given up in order to maintain power. Also, they turn the most defenseless members of society into pawns in a political drama they have no way to influence or get away from. The tragedy of Charles II was not only that he endured ailments his time could neither comprehend nor cure. Rather, it was that his role itself rendered his pain beneficial to those around him. His deterioration became something that needed hiding instead of being handled with empathy. The involvement of the medical establishment in Charles's situation has modern counterparts in today's healthcare institutions. Today's systems continue to put organizational accountability ahead of advocating for patients. And they still permit political and financial factors to outweigh clinical decisions. The royal doctors decided to facilitate the situation instead of stepping in. They were applying that same logic when it came to honestly caring for their royal patient. This is what drives today's physicians to prescribe excessive medication instead of pushing for system-wide reforms that could tackle the underlying sources of their patients' suffering. What might be most disturbing is how Charles II's narrative shows that pain can be hidden when it's in the best interest of authority for it to stay hidden. The anguish, the bewilderment, the slow fading into the labyrinth of his own injured mind. None of it mattered as much as keeping up the pretense that all was well, that the structure functioned properly. The monarch was capable, and the realm remained powerful. Those who profess to care for him, if we can even describe it as love, once affection is no different from exploitation. They ended up as partners in his decline. All of his wives, doctors, advisors, and courtiers were caught up in a system. This system required them to put the dynasty's needs ahead of the person who actually wore the crown. Charles II's nightmare went beyond his genetic disaster. It also included the elaborate concealment apparatus his condition necessitated. The true horror was not that a king had a disability, but that his impairment became an excuse to deceive, exploit, and abandon truth and compassion for a political stability that ultimately proved completely fake. The Spanish Empire outlasted Charles II by only one generation before breaking apart into competing regional forces. The Habsburg line continued in Austria, but never regained the global dominance it once held from Madrid. Within decades of his death, the whole intricate system built to hide one man's suffering fell apart into irrelevance. Yet, the patterns persisted. Institutions adapted. And we still face those same essential choices. Do we see human vulnerability as something to hide or accept? Do we treat suffering as a threat to manage or a condition to address with compassion? Should we structure our societies around the myth of human perfection or the reality of human limitation? Charles II died on November 1. 1700, but the inner torment he carried remains with us, still shaping our institutions, still demanding silence and complicity from those who prefer comfortable lies to confronting hard truths. He was not just a king hiding a disability. He was a person trapped in a system that made his humanity impossible to recognize. His pain invisible to history. His story useful only as a warning about the cost of believing our own lies about power, perfection, and anyone's divine right to rule over others. In the end, perhaps that is the most damning insight of all. Not that Charles II was genetically damaged, but that his society was so invested in the fiction of royal superiority that they let him suffer publicly while calling it glory. Let an empire crumble while insisting it was strong, and sacrificed truth and compassion for institutional pride built on sand. The crown outlasted the man who wore it. But the cost of that survival was measured not only in one destroyed life, but in the moral corruption of everyone who looked away when seeing clearly might have demanded they choose mercy over power, humanity over hierarchy, truth over the terrible, seductive comfort of lies that make cruelty look like duty and exploitation feel like love.